All right, picking up with the where we left off about the Commerce Compromise. Under the Compromise, we said that this compromise, the favoring point for the North, was that laws could be passed with only a two-thirds vote. This was important because back then you did not have the communication we have now. There were no phones, no computers, no fax machines. You really didn't even have a reliable post office. And when you consider the weather, and they were considering meeting in Philadelphia to do these votes, if the weather was poor, if we were talking about needing to meet after February when the roads would be defrosting and thawing out and becoming very muddy, travel just was not conducive for those times. And you'll see that there are several things that we do now in the winter, like the inauguration of the president, that had actually been moved to the spring for that very reason, that because of the weather and the conditions of the roads, it really made it very prohibitive for the government to meet. So the North, understanding that because they would obviously have more snow and more travel difficulties than the South, this was favoring to them. The compromise favored the South because it forbidded states to tax other states' exports. So if Virginia was exporting its raw goods up into New England for processing, New England could not tax the South for their goods. So this was again beneficial to them, and this helped ensure a very strong home market. Obviously, if you know that if you send your goods across the ocean to a country that's not going to tax you, or you could send them north and that state was going to tax you, you're going to go the cheaper route. So by compromising and saying that the northern states could not tax the southern states for exporting their goods up there ensured that now the South would use northern industries a whole lot more and people would quote unquote buy American. The next thing that it discussed was the motives for tariffs. Now, tariffs were a tax that was put on imports and exports. There were two reasons why a government would impose a tariff. One was to raise, obviously, money for government operations. This was one of the weaknesses that the Confederation had. The states would not allow it to tax on imports and exports, and it really could not even make any agreements or disagreements over trade. So, the first reason that a state or federal government would impose a tariff is to raise money for government operations. And the other reason was to give a domestic manufacturer an advantage over foreign ones. Now, I just mentioned this before that if the South is exporting raw materials and they need to go somewhere for final processing, the converting of sugar into rum or the converting of tobacco into cigars and so on, that of course the North would want there to be tariffs on international exports because that again would affect the bottom line of how much the seller of the goods would make, and it would encourage them to use local businesses. So the North favored the protective tariffs, which were going to be put on foreign exports. The South feared it because of how much raw materials it actually shipped out to international processors. So going down under this in this commerce agreement, they really never did come to a total resolution about how that was going to happen. And you're going to see that this issue of South being agricultural and the North being industrial and how they deal with each other, it's really going to play into the Civil War in addition to the slavery issue. The next compromise that came out was the Three-Fifths Compromise. And this was a conflict over how the states would count slaves for taxation and representation. Obviously, the South loved the idea of giving slaves full count for when it came to representation because it made their population seem larger. However, there was a downside to it, and that was they would then have to pay the tax that was put on each person, and slave owners did not want to have to pay the taxes for their slaves. So they're so what they ended up coming to a resolution about was that for every 3/5 of slaves, so for out of every five, three would be counted for taxation and representation. That's how you interpret that. That 3 out of every 5 slaves would be counted for towards the representation, but also for taxation. And they agreed that Congress would not pass any laws that would interfere with the practice of slavery for 20 years. By this point, you already have European, you're going to be having European countries drawing away from the practice of slavery. No, you will not see your Great Britain totally abolish slavery until after the 1800s or into the early 1800s. By this point, the North had also begun to weed out the practice of using slaves in northern homes at this point. So the South is becoming more and more aware that their way of life is being threatened. So by Congress, unfortunately, if they would have let things stay, if they really would have dealt with the issue, maybe slavery would have been addressed a whole lot sooner. But in our future conversations, you're going to see where the Congress and the President of the United States, they're going to do all they can to preserve the Union. And one of the things that they will do is they will happily ignore or do very little about the institution of slavery because of how adamant the South is that they need slaves in order to continue their way of life. And we'll get into more discussion once we're done with the Constitution. Number 5, most of the North had already abolished slavery. And honestly, the delegates believed that slavery would die out on its own. They truly did believe that, like the North, things would transition away from slavery. The problem is that the South, they had built their whole way of life modeled after the European aristocrats, around the the rich people. And they were all agricultural. And the more that people began to require the things they grew on their farms, the more they realized that they couldn't let go. It's the reason why, if you had been with us at the beginning of our studies, you would have found that originally Africans came over here as either freemen or indentured servants. And an indentured servant was someone who willingly signed over 7 years of their life to work for someone else, and that master would pay their way, pay their traveling expenses to come to the New World. And for those 7 years, that master would be training the indentured servant, whether it was African or European, in a trade. And when the 7 years was up, the owner was actually supposed to give them clothes, give them money, give them tools so that they could go out on their own. But as the agricultural business grew in the South, the Southerners went from having indentured slaves, they realized, or indentured servants, to having slaves, because it was, even though a slave was far more expensive than an indentured servant, you didn't have to retrain someone every 7 years to learn the business. By enforcing someone to work for you for life, you had a guaranteed worker 24/7, and you never had to retrain. And that's where the mindset went. And, for the South, they were so entrenched in their way of life, they could not see past their need to enslave other people. And which is which is very, very unfortunate. And it is a black mark on our nation's history. It's not a black mark that only our nation carries. Slavery has been used in many forms across the world and throughout all of the ages. And it comes down to a lack of appreciation for the life that God created. And unfortunately, even though many of those people went to church, they went to church as a way of earning their salvation. They did not have a true salvation experience, really, when they realized that there was nothing that they could do to earn their salvation, that they had to take the free gift of salvation that Jesus Christ died for. Capital letter F, the principles of the Constitution. First off, it was a written law. Going all the way back to Hammurabi, who had the first written law, it was very important that the leaders would rule by the written law, because if it was written down, it was harder to change. You could not fudge it. You could not, kind of gloss over it or rewrite it. If it was written down, they had to follow the letter of the law. Only an amendment could change the written law of the Constitution. Again, it could not be changed by the whims of just the people currently holding office. I'm sure you've seen where, in the first less than 20 days of, President Biden's administration, he's done nothing but sign executive orders undoing everything of his predecessor. That in and of itself is a bad precedent because it does not show security. It does not. It really erodes at the stability of a country when, at the change of control, everything gets undone. The weaknesses, obviously, of the written law would be that bad laws can make bad governments. If you have corrupt people who are self-serving and serving for, their own pocketbook, well, then bad laws can be passed. And we have seen that happen many times in our nation. Also, the weakness of the written law, it depends on the citizen's interest. A citizen, and I want you to make note of this, a citizen must understand the Constitution. Okay? You can't go around saying, well, they have it all under control, because that's when you lose your freedoms. When you don't really know what the Constitution says, then you don't understand what you're when the government comes in to tell you you can't do this or you can't do that. Like, for instance, under this pandemic, churches have been told that they can't meet and that they can't, especially the churches out in California. And you might say, well, that's totally understandable. It's a pandemic and they're trying to protect people. However, they were not willing to shut down places like casinos. And so how is it you can tell people of worship that they can't worship, but the people who have a gambling addiction, they can go gamble? Because gambling helps the state coffers. Gambling means that the casinos have to pay their gambling taxes. But see, a church is tax exempt. So really, in the eyes of government, the church doesn't benefit anyone. And it's the reason why, if you pay attention, so many lawsuits have gone up to the Supreme Court, because state governments have shut down churches and said you can't sing and you can't worship God. And here, because we do know that in the First Amendment we have the freedom of religion, these state governments stand in direct violation of our U.S. Constitution. And it's things like this where the citizens must understand their rights guaranteed by the Constitution, because if you don't, then the government is going to take it away. Little letter B, the lack of understanding could allow the government to overstep its bounds. And that is so true. So very, very true. Another one of the principles of the Constitution is that there was a separation of powers. This was influenced by the idea of a philosopher named Montesquieu, who came up with the separation of powers principle. And this basically ensures that for every branch of government we have, they are held accountable by the other two branches. And we'll discuss that more when we get into the literal reading of the Constitution that we will be doing. B, the government was going to be divided into three branches. And the first branch was the legislative branch, and they were to make the law. Then number two was the executive branch. The executive branch enforced the law. And the third branch was the judicial. I'm going to stop here and I will pick up with the next video.